When a diplomat in exile sat down in the year 1513 to compose a small, unadorned book intended as a job application, he did not merely write a manual for tyrants. He poured onto the page the sediment of 3,000 years of human failure, ambition, and survival. The result, The Prince, is less an invention and more a seismograph reading of the tremors that had long been shaking the foundations of power. To read it is to wonder. Where did he find these brutal lessons? Who were the ghosts whispering in Niccolo Machiavelli's ear as his quill scratched across the paper in the dim light of his farmhouse in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, a tiny hamlet 7 miles south of Florence? The answer is not buried in the libraries of Florence alone. It is carved into the stone reliefs of the ancient Near East. It echoes in the clatter of dice on the banks of the Indus River, and it stains the waters of the Aegean Sea, where Athenian triremes rammed into the hulls of their sister cities. Machiavelli, though a man of the Italian Renaissance, was a mental time traveler. He drew upon a vast, bloody, and intricate tapestry of history that begins not with the Medici, but with the very first moment a human being convinced another human being to obey. To understand the prince is to understand that Machiavelli did not create the rules of power. He merely wrote down the score of a game that had been played for millennia before he was born. This essay is an excavation, a long and careful sifting through the rubble of empires to find the exact shards of history that cut themselves into the mind of the Florentine secretary. We must begin, as Machiavelli himself often did in his private studies, with the ancients. But we must go further back than his beloved Livy, the Roman historian whose work, Ab Urbe Condita, was Machiavelli's constant companion. We must go to the land between the rivers, to the cradle where the very idea of the state was born. Consider Sargon of Akkad, a figure shrouded in myth, but whose political reality was pure Machiavellian calculus. It is worth noting that the historical Sargon is known to us primarily through later Mesopotamian legends and inscriptions, but his political achievement, the creation of the first true territorial empire in human history around 2334 BCE, is a matter of archaeological record. Sargon began as a cupbearer to Urzababa, the king of Kish. A cupbearer was not merely a servant who poured wine. In the ancient Near East, the cupbearer was a position of extreme trust and intimate access to the king, a role that involved tasting for poison and acting as a confidential secretary. It was a position from which one could observe the mechanics of power up close while remaining, to the outside world, invisible. Around 2334 BCE, the Sumerian king list, a historical document of immense importance, records a fracture, a rebellion, a moment of chaos. Sargon, reading the winds of fortune with a precision Machiavelli would later call virtu, a term that encompasses not just virtue but also strength, cunning, and the ability to bend fate to one's will, did not defend the dying order. He seized it. He marched north, built a new capital city called Akkad from the dust, and did not claim legitimacy from the old gods of the Sumerian city-states. He claimed it from the sword. He is recorded as having said, in a later Babylonian chronicle, that he had no rival, traversed the upper sea and the lower sea, and washed his weapons in the sea. This was not just bravado, it was the announcement of a new political reality. Machiavelli writes in Chapter 6 of The Prince about new principalities acquired by one's own arms and prowess. He holds up Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus as paragons of what he calls armed prophets, men who succeed because they rely on their own strength and not on the favor of others. But the blueprint predates them all. Sargon understood the first law of Machiavellian realism. He who depends on the goodwill of the established nobility drinks from a poisoned well. He broke the power of the Sumerian temple elites, installing his own men and, crucially, his daughter Enheduanna as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur. Enheduanna is the first named author in human history, a poet whose hymns to the goddess Inanna survive to this day. By placing his own flesh and blood at the apex of the religious hierarchy, Sargon fused political power with sacred authority. He created a standing army loyal only to the man who fed it. The lesson was not lost on the Florentine secretary, who had watched with his own eyes as mercenary captains betrayed his own Republic of Florence. The first example of the prince in action was a man carving an empire out of Mesopotamia, who knew that love is fleeting, but the fear of a professional army is eternal. This is the bedrock of the famous assertion in chapter 12 that a prince must build his foundations on his own arms and not on the borrowed swords of allies or the purchased loyalties of mercenaries. Sargon's ghost whispers in that chapter, a reminder that the man who hires his defense hires his own destruction. Travel west and a millennium forward, and we find a tale that Machiavelli knew intimately from his Greek texts, a story that illuminates another pillar of his thought, the management of the people versus the nobles. It is the story of Cypselus of Corinth. Herodotus, the great storyteller of the Greek world who wrote his histories in the 5th century BCE, recounts that an oracle at Delphi prophesied the birth of a child who would bring ruin to the ruling house of Corinth, the Bacchiadae. These rulers were an entrenched oligarchy, a closed circuit of wealth and blood, who married only among themselves and squeezed the life from the Corinthian populace. They were, in the parlance of Machiavelli, the grandi, the great ones who oppressed the people. They sent men to kill the infant Cypselus, but his mother, a woman named Labda, who was lame and therefore considered unmarriageable by the Bacchiadae, hid him in a cedar chest, a Cypsel, from which he took his name. When Cypselus grew to manhood, he did not storm the gates with an army of equals. He became the voice of the people. He positioned himself as the champion against the arrogance of the few. When he took power around 657 BCE, he became what the Greeks called a tyrannos. In our modern ear, that word is synonymous with cruelty, but to the Greeks, and certainly to Machiavelli, it simply meant one who rules outside the law or constitution. It carried no necessary moral judgment. It was a description of a political fact. Here is the Machiavellian twist, the elegant lesson embedded in the cedar chest. Cypselus ruled for 30 years without a bodyguard. How? He understood that the people, having been ground down by the Bacchiadae's petty cruelties, did not desire liberty, they desired relief. Machiavelli writes in chapter 9, "The prince who has the people for his enemy can never be secure." And elsewhere in chapter 20, "The best fortress a prince can have is not to be hated by the people." Cypselus exiled his aristocratic rivals and confiscated their land. He did not distribute it as a communal farm. He gave it to the poor. He made them stakeholders in his tyranny. He broke the back of the old nobility, not by killing them all, but by making them irrelevant, by shifting the economic center of gravity away from their estates and into the hands of smallholders who owed their prosperity directly to the man in the palace. When Machiavelli advises the prince to avoid the hatred of the populace while keeping the great in check, he is not theorizing in a vacuum. He is remembering Cypselus, the babe in the box, who understood that 100,000 grateful smallholders are a better fortress than a stone citadel manned by jealous barons. The people, if given a reason to be content, will defend the prince against the nobles, simply because the prince protects them from the nobles' greed. This is a dynamic as old as Corinth and as modern as any populist movement. Yet Machiavelli was not naive about the populace. He knew that the people could be a fickle beast, easily swayed by a handsome face and a beautiful lie, and no ancient text taught this more clearly than the tale of the Athens that murdered its own genius. We must look at the Sicilian expedition of 415 BCE. Athens was a democracy at the height of its power, swollen with tribute from its empire, a glittering tyranny of the majority over the Aegean Sea. Alcibiades, a dazzling, handsome, and utterly amoral aristocrat, a man who seemed to have stepped out of a painting of a god, convinced the Athenian assembly to launch a massive invasion of Syracuse in Sicily. The debate, as recorded by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War, a book Machiavelli studied with the intensity of a monk reading scripture, is a masterclass in the manipulation of public passion. The cautious General Nicias warned of the logistical nightmare, the distance, the unknown enemy, the sheer folly of opening a second front while Sparta still breathed down their necks. But Alcibiades promised glory and wealth. He painted a picture of a swift conquest, of the gold of Sicilian temples flowing into Athenian pockets, of an empire that would stretch to the pillars of Hercules. The people, drunk on the wine of empire and seduced by the rhetoric of expansion, voted for war. It was the largest military force ever sent forth by a single Greek city. Machiavelli read Thucydides not as a historian, but as a surgeon reads an autopsy report. The expedition was a catastrophe. The entire fleet was destroyed in the great harbor of Syracuse. Tens of thousands of Athenians died in the quarries of Syracuse, their bodies broken by hard labor and thirst, their bones left to bleach under the Sicilian sun. Thucydides writes, with a chilling finality, of the many who went out, few returned home. But what fascinated Machiavelli was not the tactical failure. It was the internal logic of the disaster. Athens did not fall because a foreign king was stronger. It fell because the demos, the people, could not handle the truth. They preferred the beautiful lie of Alcibiades to the grim reality of Nicias. They flattered themselves into oblivion. This is the core of chapter 23 of The Prince, how flatterers are to be avoided. A prince, Machiavelli insists, must choose wise men and give only them permission to speak the truth to him. But he ought to ask them about everything and listen to their opinions, and afterwards deliberate by himself and in his own way. The Athenian democracy was a prince with 1,000 heads and no filter. It flattered itself with visions of empire and ignored the voices of caution. The lesson Machiavelli drew was stark and undemocratic. Collective wisdom is often collective suicide. A single decisive mind, even a flawed one, is preferable to the roaring, directionless energy of the mob if that mob is not tempered by harsh, realistic counsel. The prince must be a sieve, not a sponge. He must listen to all, but absorb only the truth and have the discernment to know the difference. As we move from the glory of Greece to the titanic shadow of Rome, we enter Machiavelli's true cathedral. He wrote a whole book, the discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, to deconstruct Roman power, to take apart the engine of the Republic and see how each gear turned. It is a longer, more republican, and in many ways more profound work than The Prince. But within The Prince, the Roman ghosts are legion, and they are not the marble statues of the Forum gazing down with empty, noble eyes. They are the sweating, scheming, and often terrified men of the late Republic, men who held power by the thinnest of threads. If you want to understand Machiavelli's most famous question, the one that has echoed down the centuries like a curse or a challenge, about whether it is better to be loved or feared, do not look to Cesare Borgia first. Look to Lucius Cornelius Sulla and Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius was a military reformer, a man of the people, a rough-hewn soldier from the Italian countryside who shattered the old aristocratic monopoly on the legions. He opened the army to the landless poor, the capite censi, who owned nothing but their bodies and were counted in the census not by property, but merely by their heads. He promised them land and plunder in return for their service. He was loved by his soldiers because he gave them a future they could not have dreamed of. They called him the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. But his love turned into factional bloodshed, a bitter civil war against the aristocrat Sulla. When Sulla, a man of ancient lineage, chilling cruelty, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny, marched his own legions on Rome itself in 88 BCE, an act of unprecedented sacrilege against the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium. He did not seek love. He sought fear. He understood that the love of the people had been Marius's shield, but that shield had proven to be made of parchment against the steel of a determined enemy. Sulla invented the proscription list, a public posting of names of his enemies, posted in the Forum for all to see. Anyone on that list could be killed by anyone else, and the killer was rewarded with a portion of the victim's estate. It was legalized murder, a bounty system for the soul. The streets of Rome ran with the blood of senators and businessmen. Heads were displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform, a grisly warning to anyone who thought of resistance. Sulla had himself declared dictator for an indefinite period, a title that in the Old Republic was meant to last only 6 months in an emergency. Machiavelli examined this with the cold eye of a clinician. Sulla secured his power through the most extreme form of cruelty well used. And then, confounding all expectations, after he had rewritten the constitution to favor the aristocracy and crushed all opposition, Sulla resigned the dictatorship in 79 BCE and retired to his villa in Puteoli to drink, fish, hunt, and write his memoirs. He walked through the forum without a bodyguard, the very men whose fathers and brothers he had murdered, now forced to bow and call him a private citizen. He died in bed the following year. How did this monster survive? Machiavelli's answer in Chapter 8 is subtle and precise, a distinction that separates the successful tyrant from the failed one. Cruelties, he argues, should be inflicted all at once, so that being tasted less, they offend less, while benefits should be distributed little by little, so that they may be savored more. Sulla did not nickel and dime his terror. He unleashed a thunderstorm of killing that lasted a few months, then he stopped. The state was too exhausted to resist, and the memory of the fear outlasted the act. Compare that to Machiavelli's contemporary example of the Baglioni family in Perugia, who killed intermittently, keeping the wound fresh and the hatred festering. Sulla was the ancient proof that fear, if applied with surgical and temporary brutality, is a more durable bond than the flimsy affection of a populace that will sell you for a loaf of bread the moment the harvest fails. This is the soil from which the famous dictum grows. It is much safer to be feared than loved when one of the two must be lacking. And the crucial caveat follows. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that, if he does not win love, he avoids hatred. Sulla, by stopping the prescriptions, avoided the hatred that comes from perpetual terror. But the Roman example Machiavelli cherishes most, the one that casts the longest shadow over his entire philosophy and provides the most vivid illustration of his animal metaphor, is the story of the Emperor Septimius Severus. Severus was an African-born Roman of Punic and Italian descent who seized the imperial purple in the chaotic year of the Five Emperors in 193 CE, a time when the Praetorian Guard was literally auctioning off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. Machiavelli calls him a lion and a fox in perfect harmony. Let us dissect how Severus dealt with his rivals, for this is the masterclass in political zoology. He had two main threats: Clodius Albinus, a powerful general commanding the legions in Britain, and Pescennius Niger, another general commanding the wealthy legions of Syria. A lesser man, a mere lion, might have fought both at once and been crushed between them. Severus was the fox first. He wrote to Albinus, the closer threat in the west, and offered to make him Caesar, his junior partner and designated heir. He sent letters dripping with flattery and promises of shared power. Albinus, flattered and greedy, content with the title and the illusion of future glory, accepted. He stayed his hand. Severus then marched east and crushed Niger in a brilliant campaign, crossing into Asia Minor and defeating him decisively at the Battle of Issus in 194 CE. With the east secured, his legions now loyal and battle-hardened, Severus turned on Albinus. He had given Albinus time to grow complacent, to believe in the lie. Then, like the lion, he pounced. He crossed the Alps and defeated and killed Albinus in a brutal, grinding battle near Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon in Gaul, in 197 CE. Machiavelli marvels at this. He knew well how to play the fox and the lion, he writes in Chapter 18. The fox recognizes traps, the lion frightens wolves. Severus never announced his true intentions. He lied to a rival's face with a smile and a title, all while preparing the dagger. He understood that a prince must be a great simulator and dissimulator. This is not a moral endorsement of lying. It is a technical observation of how power is consolidated in a world where the rules are written by the winners. The layman might ask, but isn't lying bad? Machiavelli, using Severus as his Exhibit A, responds, It is bad for you if you get caught too soon. The art of the fox is not about being a pathological liar. It is about timing the revelation of truth until it is too late for the other party to react. Men are so simple, he notes, and so ready to obey present necessities, that he who deceives will always find someone willing to be deceived. Severus found Albinus, and the history of Rome was written in the blood of Gaul. A historical note adds further weight to this example. Severus died of natural causes in York, England, in 211 CE, having secured the empire for his sons. He was, by the brutal standards of Roman imperial politics, a success. Machiavelli, who rarely offers unqualified praise, writes of Severus, "He was a man of great ability, both as a soldier and as a statesman." This is high praise from the Florentine. We cannot leave the ancient world without acknowledging the empire that Machiavelli's Italy saw as both a mirror and a warning, a vast, opulent, and terrifying presence on the edge of the European imagination. Persia. Specifically the story of Darius the Great and the false Smerdis. This is a tale of what Machiavelli would call a civil principality, where the prince is raised up by fellow citizens or nobles, and it is a tale about the supreme importance of seeming. When Cambyses, son of Cyrus the Great, died in 522 BCE under mysterious circumstances while returning from a campaign in Egypt, a Magian priest named Gaumata pretended to be Cambyses's murdered brother, Bardia, known to the Greeks as Smerdis, and seized the throne of the Achaemenid Empire. For months, the vast machinery of the Persian Empire, from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, obeyed this impostor because they believed in the bloodline. It was a conspiracy of the court elite, a shadow government hiding behind the mask of a dead prince's name. 7 Persian noblemen, including Darius, a young man from a cadet branch of the royal Achaemenid house, discovered the fraud. They assassinated the false Smerdis in a nighttime raid in the palace at Susa, stabbing him to death in the darkness of his chambers. The empire was headless. The 7 conspirators met to decide the future of the world. According to Herodotus, they debated the merits of democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy in a scene that is one of the first recorded political philosophy debates in history. Otanes argued for rule by the people, for equality before the law. Megabyzus argued for rule by the few best men and oligarchy of virtue, and Darius argued for rule by the one best man, a monarchy. Then, in a scene that is pure Machiavellian comedy, a farce that determines the fate of millions, they agreed to settle the question of who would be king by a contest of equestrian timing. Whose horse neighed first at sunrise would be king. Darius's groom, a man named Oibares, had a trick. He rubbed his hand on a mare's genitals and then let Darius's stallion smell his hand at the appointed spot outside the city gates. The stallion, driven mad by the scent, neighed with such force that thunder and lightning flashed from a clear sky, a divine omen, the other 6 nobles thought. They dismounted and prostrated themselves before Darius in the dust. What is the lesson here? It is not just about the cleverness of a groom. It is about the necessity of seeming. Darius was not chosen by God. He was chosen by a horse's libido and a clever trick. But the story told to the empire, carved into the rock face of Behistun in modern-day Iran in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, for all the world to see, was of a divine sign, of the favor of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. The Behistun inscription, which still stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, tells of Darius striking down the lie and restoring truth. It is one of the most important documents in the history of the ancient Near East. Machiavelli's most famous dictum, the one that has made his name a synonym for cynical manipulation, is born from this ancient understanding of the gap between the palace bedroom and the public square. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. The people need to believe in the sanctity of the decision. They cannot know about the mare's hand. Darius ruled for 36 years, stabilizing the largest empire the world had ever seen, building the royal road that connected Susa to Sardis, and organizing the satrapies into efficient administrative units, because he was the ultimate fox. He looked like a sacred king chosen by heaven, but he acted with the cold pragmatism of a conspirator who knew exactly how the sausage was made. He understood that the prince must appear, in Machiavelli's words from chapter 18, all mercy, all faith, all integrity, all humanity, all religion, and nothing is more necessary to appear to have than this last quality. The illusion of divine favor, whether manufactured by a groom's cunning or a priest's blessing, is the most potent weapon in the arsenal of power. As we emerge from the broad canvas of antiquity and step into the narrow, treacherous alleyways of the Italian Renaissance, we see the final, most vivid influences on the prince, the Italian city-states, and the Borgia family. But even here, in the age of gunpowder and printing presses, Machiavelli is just a student of the oldest school, applying ancient lessons to modern players. When he writes of Agathocles of Syracuse, the potter's son who rose to be king by inviting the entire Senate of Syracuse to a meeting, and then, at a prearranged signal, massacring every last one of them in one fell swoop around 317 BCE, he is seeing the ghost of Sulla in Sicily, a cruelty well used, a single sharp stroke that cleared the board and allowed a new game to begin. Agathocles, he notes, lived long and securely in his city and defended it from the Carthaginians, even carrying the war to Africa itself. His vicious deeds were the foundation upon which his subsequent, more moderate rule was built. The lesson from chapter 8 is that cruelty can be the midwife of stability, provided the midwife knows when to stop cutting. I believe that this depends on whether cruelty is well or badly used, Machiavelli writes, and Agathocles is his prime example of the former. When Machiavelli dissects the failure of Louis XII of France, who invaded Italy in 1499 and then lost it all within a decade, he is applying the lesson of Severus the fox. Louis, he writes in chapter 3, made 5 great errors. He destroyed the minor powers who were his natural buffers. He increased the power of a greater power, Spain, already present in Italy. He brought in a foreign potentate, the Spanish king Ferdinand, who was far more ambitious than himself. He did not come to live in Italy himself to secure his new kingdom, and he did not send colonies of his own people to hold the land. Louis failed to be either lion or fox. He was merely a bull in a china shop, smashing what he should have preserved and goring himself on what he should have avoided. He is the cautionary tale, the negative example that proves the rule. He who is the cause of another's advancement is the cause of his own ruin, Machiavelli writes, a truth as old as the Hittites and as fresh as the morning's news. Louis's failure was not a failure of military power. It was a failure of political intelligence, a failure to understand the ancient, immutable dynamics of power that Sargon and Severus had mastered. And when he writes of Cesare Borgia, the Duke Valentino, he is not describing a hero. He is describing a chemical reaction under a microscope, a perfect storm of virtu and fortuna. Cesare did everything the ancient manuals of tyranny suggested. His father, Pope Alexander VI, gave him the temporal power of the Papal States. Cesare used a cruel lieutenant, Ramiro de Orco, a man known for his harshness and efficiency, to pacify the lawless Romagna. Ramiro broke the petty tyrants, hanged the bandits, and restored order with an iron fist. When the job was done and the people began to hate Ramiro for his severity, Cesare had Ramiro arrested, and one morning the people of Cesena awoke to find Ramiro's body cut in 2 pieces and placed in the town square, with a block of wood and a bloody knife beside him. The brutality of the act was matched only by the brilliance of its symbolism. The knife and the block spoke of justice, of a prince who had rooted out a cruel minister. The people were satisfied, stunned, and terrified into a new kind of loyalty. Cesare transferred the hatred onto a subordinate and took the credit for the peace. This is not a Renaissance innovation. This is the playbook of the Akkadian governors and the Persian satraps. The prince is the distant, merciful sun. The underlings are the storm clouds that must occasionally be made to rain blood so the sun can shine again. Cesare Borgia was the living embodiment of the ancient lessons. a man who understood that the cruelty of the lion must be followed by the cunning of the fox. His only mistake, Machiavelli notes with a tinge of sorrow and professional admiration, was to allow the election of a pope, Julius II, who was his enemy. But that was a stroke of fortuna, the wild, unpredictable tide of fate that can drown even the most virtuous prince. Machiavelli famously writes that Fortuna is a woman and that she yields only to the young and audacious. Cesare, for all his audacity, was undone by a single miscalculation of the papal conclave. What then, after this long journey through the blood-soaked soil of history, is the central thread that binds Sargon to Cypselus, Sulla to Severus, Darius to Borgia? It is the unflinching acceptance of what Machiavelli called verità effettuale della cosa, the effectual truth of the thing. This phrase, found in chapter 15, is perhaps the most important in all of Machiavelli's work, the key that unlocks the entire grim library. He was not interested in imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist. He wanted to know what men actually do, not what they ought to do. Every story we have recounted, from the horse's neigh at the gates of Susa to the bisected corpse in the piazza of Cesena, is a testament to the gap between the ideal and the real. The history that Machiavelli drew upon was not a collection of moral fables. It was a ledger of cause and effect. It taught him that a prince who acts according to conventional virtue among men who are not virtuous is simply preparing the ground for his own grave. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to ruin among so many who are not good. This is not cynicism. It is the tragic realism of a man who had seen Florence, the flower of the Renaissance, trampled by the boots of foreign armies because its leaders preferred beautiful speeches to effective action. In the final analysis, the history Machiavelli drew upon when writing The Prince is the complete and unredacted record of human governance, a record written in cuneiform on clay tablets, in Greek on papyrus scrolls, in Latin on vellum codices, and in Italian on the marble facades of palaces. He saw that the prayers of priests, the promises of politicians, and the poetry of philosophers were all just the surface layer of a deeper, uglier, and more permanent tectonic plate. By the time he sat in his study in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, wearing the fine robes of his former diplomatic life just to feel worthy of reading Livy and Tacitus, he was not inventing a new morality. He was stripping away the last vestiges of hypocrisy that clung to the old one. He wrote The Prince not because he loved despots, but because he loved Florence, and he had seen with his own eyes, in the sack of Prato in 1512, in the flight of the Medici, in the arrogance of Savonarola's bonfires of the vanities, what happens when a state refuses to look at the face in the ancient mirror. He simply polished the glass that Sargon, Cypselus, Sulla, and Darius had left behind, and held it up for the modern world to see, and the reflection, for better or worse, is still our own. The game has not changed. The board is larger, the pieces are faster, but the rules Machiavelli transcribed from the whispers of history remain as fixed as the stars. The fox still recognizes the trap, the lion still frightens the wolves, and the prince who fails to learn the lessons of the past is condemned not just to repeat them, but to be consumed by them. We've reached the end. Thank you for listening all the way through. This was The History That Inspired Machiavelli's The Prince, brought to you by Steve Buttercup III. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscribe go a long way. And if you have thoughts on the story, or if something stood out, let me know in the comments. I want to also address the change in the channel's identity. If you subscribed for content about famous art, I'm sorry to let you down. The first long audio I made, The History of Memento Mori, was more successful than all other videos combined for total view duration. This change to making audiobooks on a wider variety of subjects might also have more interest and a larger audience than famous art, at least in the way I was presenting it. Thank you for listening, and I hope to find you again.